When you close your eyes at night, you assume the person next to you is your safest place. I thought that too, until I discovered the man sharing my pillow had been quietly destroying my body for years. Good afternoon, my dears. My name is Eleanor Miller, and I'm 83 years old. Today, I'm finally ready to tell you a story I hid in my heart for decades. Before I begin, please like this video, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. It means more to me than you think. I was born in 1942, in a little Kentucky town called Pine Ridge. We were simple folks. My father worked in the coal mines. My mother looked after me and my 5 brothers and sisters. Back then, girls weren't expected to study much. I left school after 4th grade to help at home, while my brothers kept going. At 19, I met Gerald at a church social. He had a good job at the textile factory, the pride of our area. Everyone said I'd hit the jackpot when he started courting me. People didn't date for long in those days. Within 6 months, we were engaged. And before I turned 20, I was a married woman. We moved into a small blue 2-story house with white windows, just a short walk from the factory. I planted flowers out front, embroidered tablecloths for the kitchen, and packed his lunch every morning. For the first 3 years, it felt like the life every young wife dreamed of. He went to work. I took care of the house. We visited my parents after Sunday church and prayed for children. But the children never came. We were sad at first, but Gerald would say, "At least we have more time for each other." I believed him. I believed everything he said. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband. Then, in 1965, after 3 years of marriage, something changed. Gerald got promoted, started working closely with the factory owner, going on trips and business dinners. I was so proud of him. I didn't know that while his career was rising, my health and my trust were about to fall apart in ways I couldn't even imagine. I thought I was just getting weak nerves. I had no idea the real problem was quietly waiting in my own kitchen. Gerald's promotion brought new routines, overtime, late returns, trips to Chicago, fancy business dinners. I missed him, but whenever he came home with new stories about the factory, I smiled and told myself, my husband is going somewhere in life. That's when the pains began. At first, it was just my fingers. I'd wake up feeling like I'd spent the night clenching my hands into fists. Then my legs started burning as if my muscles were on fire. Even though I hadn't done anything unusual, I blamed it on housework, tiredness, and getting older, even though I was still in my early 20s. When I mentioned it to Gerald, he suggested I visit Dr. Paul, the town doctor. He checked me quickly, gave me some pain pills, and sent me home. Nothing serious, he said. I wanted so badly to believe him. But the pain didn't stop. It got worse. I went back to Dr. Paul again and again. Each time his patients grew thinner. He'd tell me to keep busy, find a hobby, stop worrying so much. The message was clear. To him, my suffering was mostly in my head. By 1967, the pain was so intense that Gerald took me to a specialist in Louisville. We spent almost all our savings on x-rays, blood tests, and exams. The final answer? A complicated label that basically meant, it's psychological. They said I needed rest, sedatives at night, and vitamins. We returned home with a bag full of pills. Gerald started bringing me a sedative every evening in a glass of warm milk, saying it would help me sleep. I trusted him. After all, he was the one taking me to doctors and buying the medicine. But as the years passed, my pain only deepened. My hair thinned, my nails broke easily, my clothes hung loose from my shrinking body. Some mornings, I could hardly drag myself out of bed. Neighbors whispered behind my back. People avoided the word cancer, but I saw it in their eyes. Meanwhile, Gerald was more distant than ever, more overtime. More late nights, more irritation whenever I asked how work was going. I thought my body was betraying me. The truth was much darker. Everyone said the problem was in my head. It took one bold neighbor to suggest the unthinkable. What if the danger was actually in my own home? By 1969, my pain had become my shadow. I prayed, fasted on Fridays, lit candles at church, begging God to either heal me or show me what was wrong. Around that time, a new neighbor moved into the house next door, Mrs. Clark. She wasn't like the other women in Pine Ridge. She wore pants, drove her own car, and sat on the porch, smoking, while reading thick books. People said she wasn't a proper lady. Maybe that's why I felt drawn to her. I was tired of pitying looks and whispers. One afternoon, when Gerald was at work, I gathered the courage to visit her. She welcomed me warmly, made us tea, and for the first time in years, someone truly listened. I told her everything: the pain, the doctors, the gossip, the sedatives. Mrs. Clark didn't roll her eyes or tell me it was stress. Instead, she started asking careful questions, like a detective. "Do your pains get worse on certain days?" she asked. "After certain meals? Or after something specific happens at home?" No doctor had ever asked me that. On her suggestion, I began to keep a small notebook, writing down when the pain was worst. After a few weeks, a chilling pattern appeared. My worst mornings were always after nights when Gerald came home late and brought me that glass of milk with the sedative. On days when he came home at his normal time, or when he didn't bring the milk, I woke up feeling a little better. I showed my notes to Mrs. Clark. I saw something flicker in her eyes, concern and maybe fear. "Eleanor," she said carefully, "for one night, don't take the pill. Pretend you did. Hide it. Then lie down and act like you're asleep. Let's see what happens." Her words shocked me. The idea that my own husband could be involved in my suffering felt crazy, almost sinful to think. I defended him out loud, but inside, a tiny seed of doubt had been planted. That night, I stared at the glass of milk and the little pill in Gerald's hand, and I had no idea that what I did next would change my life forever. I decided to fake swallowing the pill. I thought I'd prove my neighbor wrong. Instead, I caught my husband doing something I can still see in my nightmares. The first night, fear won. I swallowed the sedative like always, telling myself Mrs. Clark was overreacting. But the next night, I gathered what courage I had left. When Gerald handed me the pill and milk, I lifted the glass, pretended to put the pill in my mouth, but hid it in my palm. I drank the milk, smiled, and wished him good night. Then I lay with my back to him, heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. When his breathing finally grew deep and heavy, I quietly slipped out of bed, went to the bathroom, and flushed the pill. Then I returned, closed my eyes, and pretended to sleep. Around midnight, I felt the mattress shift. Gerald carefully got up. Through my half-closed eyes, I watched him stand over me, checking if I was really asleep. Satisfied, he left the room. I waited a moment, then followed him barefoot, keeping to the shadows of the hallway. From the crack in the kitchen door, I saw him open the cabinet where we kept cleaning products. He took out a small, unlabeled bottle, poured a few drops into my blue morning coffee cup, and put it back. My stomach turned cold. I slipped back upstairs before he returned. I lay down in bed, forcing my body to stay still while my mind screamed, "What is he giving me?" Those bad mornings suddenly had a possible explanation, and it was standing at my sink. The next day, as soon as Gerald left for work, I ran straight to Mrs. Clark and told her everything, shaking and crying. She didn't look surprised, only deeply sad. "We need proof," she said, "something no one can deny." She called her son George, a young man who lived in the city and loved photography. 2 days later, he arrived with a camera that could shoot in low light. We hid it on top of the kitchen cabinet behind a plant, pointed right at the counter where my cups stood. That night, I once again pretended to take the sedative, pretended to sleep, and once again, Gerald got up around midnight and went downstairs. The camera was waiting. Rehook. When we developed those photos, there was no more room for doubt. But the real horror wasn't just what he was doing. It was why. The following morning, after Gerald left, I rushed to Mrs. Clark's house with the camera. George carefully removed the film, explaining he'd develop it in a makeshift darkroom in his mother's bathroom. Those 3 days felt like 3 years. When George finally emerged with the photos, my hands shook as I held them. There it was in black and white. My husband, in our kitchen at night, taking the small bottle from the cabinet, tilting it over my cup, drops falling into the liquid. There was no way to explain that away as vitamins. Mrs. Clark knew a trusted pharmacist in Louisville, Mr. Mendez, who sometimes helped her former students understand medications. We traveled to see him, carrying the photos and my story. After examining the bottle's shape in the pictures and listening to my symptoms, he gave us a terrifying possibility. Some kind of diluted rat poison used in tiny doses over a long time. Not enough to kill instantly, but enough to slowly destroy joints, organs, and strength. If you'd kept taking that for a few more years, he told me gently, your death would have looked natural, some long illness. Almost no one would question it. I walked out of that pharmacy feeling like the world had tilted. It wasn't my body betraying me. It was my husband. Back home, I hid at Mrs. Clark's house for 3 days. We sent word to Gerald that I was in the hospital in Louisville. In reality, I stayed next door, trying to drink water, rest, and understand why the man who vowed to love me would want me gone. George, thinking like a practical outsider, said, "If he's trying to get rid of you, there's probably more to it than money. Usually there's another woman." He offered to follow Gerald after work. I didn't want to believe it, but I let him go. That night, George parked near the factory and watched. Sure enough, Gerald didn't leave alone. He left with an elegant woman and drove to a large house in the next town. They went inside, hand in hand, like a couple. The woman, we learned later, was Helena Mendoza, the wealthy sister-in-law of the factory owner, recently widowed and now rich. Poison, betrayal, another woman. My life had become a twisted crime story. Now I had a choice, run and disappear, or walk back into that house, face my would-be killer, and secretly record exactly what he'd done. When George told me about Helena and the big house, something inside me broke. Any tiny hope that this was all some tragic misunderstanding died that night. It wasn't an accident. It was a plan. Mrs. Clark asked quietly, "Do you want to go straight to the police or confront him yourself first?" George warned that the photos alone might not be enough. Gerald could claim it was medicine, some special tonic for my nerves. We needed something stronger, his own words. So we came up with a dangerous plan. George lent me a small tape recorder, the kind reporters used. He showed me how to slide it into the pocket of my apron and flip it on without anyone noticing. I would go back home, pretend I'd been discharged from the hospital, act normal, and then find the right moment to confront him with the bottle and the pictures, all while the recorder captured everything. I was terrified, but also strangely calm. For 7 years I'd been slowly dying without answers. Now I had a chance to fight back. I returned home on a Friday afternoon. The house felt different, like it belonged to strangers. Gerald wasn't there. It was overtime day, as I now understood too well. I searched the kitchen and found the small, unlabeled bottle hidden at the back of the cabinet, behind canned food. I didn't open it. Just touching it made my skin crawl. I put it back exactly where it was. Then I cooked his favorite meal, rice, beans, and steak with onions. I showered, put on a clean nightgown, and tucked the recorder into my apron. When Gerald finally came home, he smelled of expensive cologne. His eyes widened when he saw me standing in the kitchen, looking healthier than he expected. "The doctor said it wasn't serious," I said lightly. "They changed my medicine and sent me home. I made your favorite dinner." He seemed nervous, unsure how to act around this version of me. We ate, talked about small things. He avoided meeting my eyes. After dinner, he went upstairs to shower. I took a deep breath, switched on the recorder in my apron pocket, and placed the bottle right in the center of the kitchen table. What happened when he came back would decide the rest of my life. He froze when he saw that bottle. And when he finally opened his mouth, what he confessed was even colder than the poison itself. When Gerald came back into the kitchen and saw the unlabeled bottle on the table, the color drained from his face. He looked from the bottle to me like a trapped animal. "What's this doing here?" he stammered. "I was about to ask you the same thing," I replied as calmly as I could. "Why do we have rat poison in our food cabinet, Gerald?" He tried to deny it, of course. Said it was some cleaning product, said I shouldn't mess with things I didn't understand. My hands were shaking under the table, but I didn't let my voice tremble. "I understand enough to know you've been putting this in my coffee," I said. I understand that my pain for the last 7 years isn't in my head. You're trying to kill me. What I don't understand is why. He called me crazy, said the doctors were right about my nerves. So I quietly placed the photos on the table, one by one. Him in the kitchen at night, the bottle in his hand, the drops falling into my cup. The mask slipped. For a while he stared at the pictures in silence. Then his expression hardened into something I had never seen before. Cold. Empty. You weren't going to die right away, he finally said, almost matter of fact. It would look like a long illness. No one would suspect anything. The tape recorder in my apron captured every word. Why, Gerald, I asked. What did I do wrong? It was never about you, he said with a bitter little laugh. It's about Helena. We've been together for years. Divorce would ruin me. My job, my reputation. Her brother is a pharmacist. He knew what to use. This was just easier. Listening to him talk so calmly about my slow death, as if he were discussing a business deal, sent a chill through my bones. He even admitted they were slowly increasing the doses, watching how my body reacted. When I asked if he had ever loved me, he shrugged. Maybe in the beginning. You were young, a good wife, but Helena understands my value. With her, I can be someone. That was the moment fear turned into something else inside me. Determination. I gathered the photos, stood up and told him we had nothing more to discuss. Then I walked out, the recorder still running, straight to Mrs. Clark's house, where George was waiting. Within hours, we were sitting in front of Sheriff Morales, playing the tape and showing the photos. His face grew darker with every sentence he heard. Mrs. Miller, he finally said, you're lucky to be alive. We're arresting your husband tonight. Gerald went to jail, but surviving the murder attempt was only the beginning, because small towns never forget a scandal, and neither does your own body. The night the sheriff arrested Gerald, the whole town seemed to buzz. In a place as small as Pine Ridge, nothing stays secret for long, especially not a husband accused of poisoning his wife. The next days were a blur of whispers, pointing fingers, and pitying looks. When I walked down the street, conversations stopped. People stared as if I was some tragic character from the newspaper. There goes the woman whose husband tried to poison her, they murmured when they thought I couldn't hear. Some comments cut deeper than any physical pain. She must have done something, a few said. A man doesn't go that far for no reason. As if there could ever be a justification for slowly killing your spouse. Gerald's parents, who had always treated me like a daughter, turned against me completely. His father loudly claimed I'd invented everything because I was jealous. To him, the photos were tricks and the recording edited. The betrayal from them hurt almost as much as Gerald's. But I wasn't alone. Mrs. Clark and George were my anchors. Some neighbors brought meals. A few church ladies organized a small fund to help me with expenses. Even Dr. Paul, the doctor who had insisted my pain was psychological for years, came to apologize with tears in his eyes. I failed you, he admitted, as a doctor and as a man. I forgave him, not because it erased the suffering, but because I didn't want to stay chained to anger. 6 months later, Gerald's trial began. His lawyers tried to paint me as unstable, claimed I had fantasies, said I was dramatizing to punish him for cheating. But they couldn't argue with the hard evidence. The photos, the bottle of poison found at home, the toxic substances in my blood, the tape of his calm confession. The pharmacist from Louisville explained how the poison worked. The sheriff described the arrest. Piece by piece, the jury saw the truth. Gerald was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder. His mother collapsed in the courtroom. Watching her grief, I understood something important. She was also a victim of his choices. That didn't excuse anything, but it softened my heart. When the trial ended, I was 27 years old, with fragile health, no husband, no house. The home was sold to pay legal fees, and a town full of memories that made it hard to breathe. Mrs. Clark offered me a way out. Come with me to Louisville. Start over where people don't know your story. Leaving my hometown felt like tearing out roots, but staying felt like slowly suffocating. So So I stepped onto a bus to Louisville with 2 suitcases, not knowing that in that big, noisy city, I'd meet another older woman who would quietly rebuild my entire life. Louisville was loud, fast, and overwhelming compared to Pine Ridge. For the first weeks, I barely left the little apartment I shared with Mrs. Clark in the Highlands neighborhood. I felt like a stranger in my own country. My health was still fragile. The pain had eased since I stopped ingesting poison, but years of damage don't disappear overnight. My kidneys were weak, my stomach sensitive, and I suffered from chronic anemia. I needed ongoing treatment, this time with doctors who actually listened. The savings from selling the house were disappearing quickly. I needed to work, but what could I do? I had only basic schooling and a body that got tired easily. That's when Mrs. Clark introduced me to Mrs. Sullivan, an elderly widow in our building who needed a companion. My job would be to cook, help her with medicine, and keep her company. The pay was small, but it included a simple room in her apartment and meals. I accepted with gratitude. Mrs. Sullivan turned out to be a blessing I never expected. She'd been a university professor, had shelves full of books, and loved discussing ideas, art, history, politics, things that had never been part of my world in Pine Ridge. At first I felt embarrassed by how little I knew, but she never looked down on me. "Intelligence isn't about diplomas, Eleanor," she would say. "It's about curiosity." Under her gentle guidance, I started to read. First simple novels, then more complex books. She corrected my grammar kindly, explained words I didn't know, and encouraged my questions. One evening she said, "Eleanor, you should go back to school. It's not too late." So, at 29, I enrolled in night classes to finish my basic education. I was the oldest in the classroom, surrounded by teenagers, but every lesson felt like another step away from the frightened, poisoned girl I used to be. Years passed quietly. My health slowly improved. I built a routine, caring for Mrs. Sullivan during the day, studying at night, reading whenever I could. For the first time in a long time, my life was moving forward instead of just surviving. Then, in 1973, Mrs. Sullivan suffered a stroke. Her daughter decided to move her to New York for more intensive care. I was heartbroken to see her go. Before leaving, she took my hands and said, "I've paid for a professional sewing course for you. You have talent, use it." She had noticed the way I mended her clothes, how I adjusted hems and altered dresses. I'd never thought much of it. In Pine Ridge, sewing was just necessity. In Louisville, it would become my future. I walked into that sewing classroom thinking I'd just learn a trade. I had no idea it would turn me into a businesswoman and lead me straight to the man I'd truly love. The sewing course lasted 6 months, and from the first week, I felt something click inside me. Patterns, fabrics, shapes. It all made sense. The teacher praised my attention to detail, the way I handled tricky fabrics, how I could look at someone and imagine exactly what would fit them. When I finished the course, one of the instructors offered me a job at her atelier downtown. The salary wasn't huge, but customers tipped and work was steady. For the first time, I earned my own money with my own skills. With Mrs. Sullivan gone, I found a small studio apartment in Germantown. It was nothing fancy, a single room with a tiny kitchen, but it was mine. Holding the key in my hand that first night, I cried. It felt like proof that Gerald hadn't won. Over the next few years, I kept studying at night and working by day. My health continued to improve, though I still had bad days when old pain flared. The doctors called me lucky to have avoided more permanent damage. By 1976, I had built a reputation among customers for being careful, punctual, and honest. People started asking for me by name. The owner of the atelier eventually suggested something bigger, a partnership. She would provide the space and existing clients. I would bring my skills and hard work. Together, we opened Spring Atelier, a name that felt like a promise of rebirth. Our sign had golden letters on a pale green background. Every time I unlocked that door, it reminded me how far I'd come from lying in bed, thinking my pain was in my head. In 1977, a man named John walked in to order a suit for his daughter's wedding. He was a widower, a carpenter with rough hands and kind eyes. He didn't have Gerald's polished charm or money, but he had something I'd never truly had before: gentleness. Our relationship grew slowly. Coffee after fittings turned into Sunday lunches. I told him my story about Gerald, the poison, the trial, leaving Pine Ridge. I braced myself for pity or discomfort. John just held my hands and said, "You're the strongest woman I've ever met, Eleanor." It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was a quiet, steady building of trust. He left little notes, brought me flowers, crafted small wooden gifts like a sewing box with my name carved into the lid. In 1978, when he asked me to marry him, I said yes, not from desperation or fear of being alone, but from peace. At 38, I was marrying a man who respected my independence and never once asked me to give up my work. I thought my chance at motherhood had passed me by, until at 39, I stared at a doctor who smiled and said a word I never expected to hear: "Congratulations." After our small church wedding, I moved into John's house, a cozy place with a garden he tended with love. He never hinted that I should stop working. In fact, he'd proudly tell people, "My wife runs one of the best ateliers in Louisville." Life settled into a sweet rhythm. Then, in 1979, I started feeling unusually tired. At first, I blamed work. But a visit to the doctor turned my world upside down again, this time in a good way. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "you're pregnant." At 39, with my health history, it was considered risky. But I wanted this baby more than anything. With careful medical supervision, I carried her, despite hospital stays and strict rest at the end. In May 1980, our daughter Marianne was born, tiny but determined. Holding her in my arms felt like a final victory over everything Gerald had tried to destroy. John was a different kind of father than most men of his generation. He changed diapers, rocked her to sleep, and adjusted his carpentry schedule so we could share the load. Some neighbors raised eyebrows at a man caring for a baby, but he didn't care. Marianne grew up in a home filled with love and respect. She learned to read early, scribbled little stories, and sat in the atelier drawing dresses for modern princesses. Watching her grow was like watching my heart walk outside my body. Years passed. Spring Atelier prospered, John's carpentry business did well, and life, despite its normal ups and downs, was good. Then a letter arrived from Pine Ridge. It was from my younger sister, Nancy. Our mother was seriously ill. The doctors didn't think she had long. "She keeps asking for you," Nancy wrote. "She wants to see you one last time." I had avoided going back to Pine Ridge for 15 years. I invited my family to visit me, but I never set foot in that town again. Too many ghosts, too many memories of pain, scandal, and whispered judgments. But how could I deny my mother a last goodbye? John didn't hesitate. "We'll all go," he said. "You, me, and Marianne, together." We boarded a bus to Pine Ridge. With every mile, the old fear tightened around my chest. I held John's hand as my past rose up to meet me. I went back to say goodbye to my mother and ended up face to face with someone I never expected to see again, my ex-husband's mother, holding a message from beyond the grave. Pine Ridge hadn't changed much. A few new houses, a fresh coat of paint on the square, a TV antenna on the hill, but the same. Heavy air of everyone knowing. Everyone's business. My mother was staying with Nancy. The strong woman from my childhood was now frail, skin yellowed by liver disease. But when she saw me, her eyes lit up. When she met Marianne, she softly traced her cheek and whispered, "She looks just like you did." We spent a week there, caring for my mother, letting Marianne play with cousins she'd never met, and watching John gently win over my family. But walking through town awakened old wounds. Some people hugged me warmly. Others asked blunt questions about that horrible case, as if it were gossip instead of my life. One afternoon, while buying groceries with Marianne, an elderly woman approached. I recognized her at once, Mrs. Miller, Gerald's mother. My first instinct was to shield my daughter and walk away, but something in her eyes stopped me. There was no anger there, only loss. "Eleanor," she said softly, "may I speak with you a moment?" I sent Marianne to pick out cookies and stayed. "He died," Mrs. Miller said. Gerald, in prison, 3 years ago. Tuberculosis. I felt oddly empty. No joy, no triumph. Just the closing of a chapter. I'm sorry for your loss, I replied, and I meant it. Whatever he'd done to me, he was still her son. Before he died, she continued, tears gathering, he asked me to tell you. He regretted it. Not at first, but later. He said what he did was unforgivable, and he understood if you hated him forever. I stayed quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of her pain and my own. I don't hate him anymore, I said. Hate keeps you tied to the past. I chose to live. Mrs. Miller cried more openly then, not just for him, but for everything that had been destroyed. When Mary Ann returned, I introduced her as an old friend from Long. Ago, Mrs. Miller, held my daughter's small hand like it was something precious. A few days later, my mother passed away peacefully in her sleep. I was holding her hand when her breathing slowed and stopped. I cried, but it was a calm grief, knowing we had made our peace. At the funeral, Mrs. Miller stood quietly at the back of the church. Our eyes met once, and in that brief moment, there was an understanding, not forgetting, not erasing, but forgiveness. We left Pine Ridge the next day. As the bus pulled away, I looked out at the town that had almost killed me and also raised me. This time, I felt something new, gratitude that I had survived and walked away stronger. Life went on, with new blessings and new losses. But decades later, a journalist's phone call would reveal that Gerald's darkness went even deeper than I ever knew. The years after my mother's death brought both joy and sorrow. At 45, to everyone's surprise, I became pregnant again. Doctors were cautious, but our son Charles was born healthy, completing our little family. Spring Atelier grew, moved into a larger space, and began offering sewing, courses to young women, a way for me to pass on what Mrs. Sullivan had given me. John and I celebrated 25 years of marriage surrounded by friends, our children, and eventually grandchildren. Then came another hard blow. In 2010, John was diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer. Doctors gave him 6 months. He fought for nearly 2 years, determined to see Charles finish design school. He passed away a few weeks after the graduation, at home, surrounded by the family we had built together. Losing John was a quieter kind of pain than the one I'd known with Gerald. No betrayal, only deep absence and gratitude for every shared day. As the years passed, I stepped back from the atelier's daily operations, leaving it in the hands of trusted staff. I kept only a few long-time clients. With more free time, I began giving talks at shelters and community centers for women facing domestic violence. I didn't tell my story to shock people. I told it so those women, with bruises on their skin or hearts, could see that survival and rebuilding were possible. One afternoon when I was 73, my phone rang. A journalist named Rebecca had found my old case while researching crimes of passion in small-town America. She wanted to write an article. My first reaction was to say no. I had already told this story enough, I thought. Why reopen old wounds? But Mary Ann, now a lawyer working for women's rights, gently insisted, Mom, there are women out there who might find strength in your story. Let them see that there's life after horror. So I agreed, under 2 conditions. The interview would be in my home, with my family present, and the focus would be on overcoming, not just the crime. Rebecca arrived with a recorder and a photographer. For hours I told her everything, from the first pain in my fingers to the nursing home where I'd forgiven Helena. When I finished, I noticed she had tears in her eyes. Mrs. Miller, she said carefully, there's something I discovered while digging through old records. Something you may not know. My heart sank. After all these years, what could possibly still surprise me? Rebecca's next words made my blood run cold. Gerald hadn't tried this for the first time with me. I was his second wife, and his second poisoning. Rebecca explained that while she was researching, she had found references to a young woman who died years before I met Gerald. A first wife, a mysterious illness, no answers. Gerald was married before you, she said gently. His first wife died in less than a year, from a strange sickness doctors couldn't identify. Months later, he moved to Pine Ridge and met you. I felt sick. It wasn't just that he'd tried to kill me. He had likely succeeded with someone else. Then Rebecca told me something else. Helena was still alive, living in a nursing home in Nashville with advanced Alzheimer's. Before, her memory faded completely. She had given a local interview and confirmed her role in my poisoning, but added that it was Gerald who first proposed the idea, drawing on what had happened to his first wife. There had been another Eleanor out there, in another town, who never got a Mrs. Clark, a camera, or a second chance. I thought about it for days. Finally, I told my family and Rebecca, I want to see Helena. They were surprised. She won't recognize you, Rebecca warned. She barely recognizes anyone. I know, I said. I'm not going for her. I'm going for me. 2 weeks later, we walked into Pine Creek nursing home. Helena was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the distance. The once elegant woman Gerald had described was now fragile and empty-eyed. I sat beside her and said quietly, Helena, it's Eleanor. No reaction, no flicker of recognition. I came to tell you I forgive you, I continued. Not because what you did was small, it wasn't, but because I refused to let hatred own the last years of my life. I touched her hand. For a brief second, her fingers closed around mine. Maybe it was a reflex. Maybe something inside her remembered. I'll never know. On the way out, a nurse mentioned Helena had been there for 15 years. All her money gone in bad investments. Her last living relative, a nephew, paid her bills. The inheritance she and Gerald had, chased so ruthlessly, had slipped right through her fingers. There's a kind of justice life delivers that no judge can write. Rebecca's article came out a few months later. It showed old photos of me and Gerald, the little blue cup, the bottle, the house in Pine Ridge, but it also showed my children, my grandchildren, and me smiling in the garden John built. The response was overwhelming. Women wrote letters, called, and came up to me after talks saying, if you survived that, maybe I can survive this. And that, my dears, is why I'm telling you this story now, here, on your screen. I was once a young wife who thought she was just too sensitive. Today, at 83, I'm a grandmother who lived through poison, betrayal and grief, and still found love, purpose and peace. If you're listening and something in your life feels wrong, please don't ignore it. Talk to someone you trust. Ask for help. Your story doesn't have to end in darkness. If you'd like to hear more real stories like mine, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary, and tell me in the comments what part of my journey touched you the most. And remember, no matter how broken you feel, your next chapter can still be the most beautiful one.